something happened at the edge of the Milky Way that nobody was supposed to know about. A fleet of 3,000 warships crossed into human space. They were the most powerful weapons ever built by the Volcae Empire. The Volcae had never lost a war. Not once. In 400,000 years of existence, they had conquered over 600 worlds. They had erased entire civilizations from history. They had turned living planets into cold, lifeless rocks drifting in the dark. They expected to be done with Earth in less than 72 hours. They were wrong. What happened next was not supposed to be possible. According to every calculation, every strategic model, every intelligence report gathered over centuries of quiet observation, humanity should have been erased. Earth should have become just another empty rock in a galaxy that had stopped caring. But that is not what happened. What happened instead changed the galaxy forever. And to this day, no galactic power will speak about it openly. They will not say the word human without lowering their voice. They will not draw a star map that includes the solar system without marking it in a very specific color. Because they know something now that they cannot unknow. Let me show you exactly how this happened. For most of its history, the galaxy did not care about Earth. That is the truth nobody tells you at the start of this story. The great civilizations of the Milky Way, the Volcae Empire, the Seralith Dominion, the Pale Consortium, the architects of the Deep Ring, they had all noticed the small blue planet at some point. They had sent silent probes. They had reviewed the data. They had watched from a very safe distance as tiny, soft-bodied creatures built fires, drew pictures on cave walls, and slowly, awkwardly figured out how to survive on a world that seemed determined to kill them every few thousand years. And then they had looked away. Humans were not considered a threat. They were not even considered interesting. The Seralith, whose empire stretched across 40,000 light-years, had a specific word for species like humanity. The closest translation in English would be something like background noise, a species that exists but does not matter. A species, the galaxy, simply waits to either grow up on its own or quietly disappear. For thousands of years, that is exactly what humanity appeared to be doing. Growing, slowly, making mistakes, fighting wars among themselves, building things and tearing them down, getting sick, recovering, getting sick again. From the outside looking in, humanity looked like organized chaos wrapped in soft skinches. Loud, emotional, unpredictable, and ultimately harmless. The Galactic Assembly, the governing body that oversaw peace and trade between the major civilizations, had voted on the question of humanity exactly 4 times over 7,000 years of recorded contact. Each time, the vote was the same. Leave them alone. They are not ready. They are not worth the attention. That vote was both the greatest mistake the galaxy ever made and the single thing that gave humanity all the time it needed. Because while the galaxy looked away, humans did something that no other species had ever done in quite the same way. They refused to stay small. There was a man named Commander Elias Voss who understood this better than anyone alive at the time. He was 43 years old, gray-haired before his time, with the kind of steady eyes that had seen too many difficult things and processed every single one of them completely. He had spent 20 years serving in the United Earth Defense Corps, a military organization that most ordinary humans did not know existed and that the rest of the galaxy did not take seriously in the slightest. On the morning that changed everything, Voss was sitting in a briefing room on Lunar Station 7, drinking cold coffee and reading the same intelligence report for the 3rd time. The report was simple, clean, and absolutely terrifying. An alien fleet had been detected entering the outer edge of the solar system. Not a small patrol, not a survey mission, a war fleet. 3,000 vessels, each one larger than any aircraft carrier ever built by human hands, moving in a tight formation that left absolutely no question about their purpose. They were not coming to talk. They were not coming to observe. They were coming to end things. Voss set his coffee down very carefully. He looked at the junior officer standing across the table from him, a young woman named Lieutenant Sierra Holt, who had gone completely pale the moment the report had come through the secure channel. How long? Voss asked. At their current speed, Holt checked her screen twice before answering. 72 hours before they reach Earth orbit. Voss nodded slowly. He stood up. He walked to the observation window of the briefing room, which looked out over the gray dust surface of the moon, and beyond it, the soft, impossibly blue curve of Earth hanging in the absolute darkness of space. He had read everything available about the Vorkai. Everyone in the UEDC had. They were one of the oldest empires in the known galaxy. Their technology made human weapons look like historical curiosities. Their ships carried energy weapons that could split open a planet's crusty way a knife opens an orange. In 400,000 years of recorded history, they had never once failed to conquer a world they had targeted. Not once. Not ever. Voss stared at Earth for a long moment. 72 hours. Then he turned back around. "Get me the general," he said quietly. "And somebody get me fresh coffee. We have a great deal of work to do." Not one person in that room believed they were going to survive what was coming. But every single one of them immediately began working anyway. That was the very first thing the galaxy had never understood about humans. They work the hardest when they are the most certain they are going to lose. Supreme Commander Drathvel of the Vorkai Empire had personally conquered 11 worlds across his long career. He was not cruel being by his own people's standards. He was efficient. He believed deeply in quick endings and clean results. He believed that a civilization which could not properly defend itself did not deserve to continue existing, not because he lacked compassion, but because that was the simple logic of the universe as he had understood it for 4 centuries. The strong survive. The weak are absorbed or erased. This was not evil. This was simply the way things worked. When High Command assigned him the Earth mission, his first honest reaction had been mild, professional annoyance. Earth was beneath him. The briefing had been straightforward enough. Humanity had been flagged by the Seralith Dominion as what their analysts called a developing threat, not an immediate danger to anyone, not a military power of any real significance. But the Seralith had been quietly monitoring human technological progress for 2 full centuries, and the numbers had begun to concern their most careful analysts. Humans were advancing faster than any species of their developmental age had any right to be. They were building energy weapons, developing deep space travel capability, experimenting with biological augmentation, and doing something stranger still, developing a kind of networked global intelligence that connected information across billions of individual minds simultaneously and produced results that no single mind could have generated alone. The Seralith had brought their concerns to the Galactic Assembly. The vote that time had been different. 5 of the 7 major powers agreed. Humanity needed to be stopped before it became something that genuinely could not be stopped. The Vorkai had been chosen to handle the situation because they were the most reliable at handling situations cleanly and completely. 3,000 ships, 72 hours, 1 small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable star. Drathvel had done comparable work faster with far less before. His fleet crossed the outer edge of the solar system at 0400 hours by Earth's own calendar. His sensor arrays lit up the moment they entered the system. Humans had detection systems positioned far further out than any intelligence report had suggested. They had already spotted his fleet. He watched the signal traces of human communication spread across their world, like fire moving through dry grass in a strong wind. Billions of signals. Messages flying between cities, military installations, orbital stations, deep space outposts. They were panicking. Of course they were panicking. What else would they do? Drathvel gave the order to maintain current course and speed. No reason to accelerate. He had found that giving a civilization time to fully process what was coming produced better results in the end. A panicking species made desperate, unpredictable decisions. And desperate, unpredictable decisions sometimes caused unnecessary damage to valuable ships. Better to let them exhaust their fear before the engagement began. But something strange happened as his fleet continued moving deeper into the solar system. The panic signals stopped. Not gradually, not slowly winding down. All at once, as if someone had simply turned off a switch. The frantic chatter disappeared completely. The emergency broadcasts cut off. The billions of simultaneous signals that had been flying across the planet went quiet in a way that made the silence feel deliberate rather than defeated. Then, after exactly 47 minutes of total silence, a single transmission came through on a frequency that his communications officer confirmed was a universal open channel, one that any spacefaring species would immediately recognize as a direct invitation to respond. The message was transmitted in 17 different languages. Drathvel's translator rendered it into Vorkai Standard in under a second. It said, "This is Commander Elias Voss of the United Earth Defense Corps. We know you are coming. We know why you are coming. We want you to know something important before you arrive. We have been watching this galaxy a great deal longer than you believe. We know exactly what happened to the other 600 worlds your empire has visited. We know exactly what your fleet does. We want you to understand clearly we are not afraid. Come ahead. We will be ready." Drathvel stared at the message for an unusually long time. His second-in-command, Kale Sorn, turned toward him wearing an expression that Vorkai officers almost never allowed themselves to show. "Should we be concerned, Commanders?" Drathvel thought about every world he had ever conquered. He thought about how not one of them, not a single civilization across 11 campaigns, had ever sent a message like that one. Every other species facing his fleet had either begged or gone completely silent. Not one of them had ever transmitted the words, "We will be ready," with the specific, quiet certainty that he heard underneath those words. "Maintain course," he said finally. But for the first time in his long career, he ordered a second full tactical assessment before issuing any further commands. The first real engagement happened 16 hours before the Vorkai fleet reached Earth orbit. Nobody on either side had expected it to start that far out. Drathvel had fully assumed that humanity would wait, that they would pull their small defensive forces close to their own planet and attempt a last stand in the familiar shadow of their world. That was what every species did. They clustered near home. They held the ground they knew for as long as they possibly could. It was biological, emotional, entirely predictable. Instead, humanity came out to meet them. Not with a conventional fleet. Humanity did not have any fleet capable of facing 3,000 Vorkai warships in open space on equal terms. What they sent instead was something that Drathvel's tactical analysis systems spent a full 40 seconds attempting to classify before simply labeling it with a single word. Unknown. It looked, at first pass, like debris. Thousands of small objects, each one roughly the size of a surface transport vehicle, drifting through open space in what appeared to be completely random. Disorganized patterns. No active energy signatures. No detectable propulsion systems. No weapons visible on any scanner at any frequency. Just metal shapes, tumbling quietly and harmlessly through the dark space between his approaching fleet and the distant blue light of their planet. His second-in-command had recommended clearing the debris field with a standard weapons sweep before advancing further. Drathvel had agreed without hesitation. That single decision was the first mistake. The moment the first Vorkai energy weapon discharged and struck one of the drifting objects, every single device in the field activated simultaneously. Not one at a time. Not in sequence. All of them, at the exact same instant, as if they were all one single mind. They were not debris. They were mines. But they were not any kind of mine that Vorkai weapons science had ever actually encountered in combat. They did not simply explode outward. When triggered, each device generated a highly localized gravitational pulse, a technology that Vorkai scientists had theorized about in academic papers, but had never once successfully constructed or tested. Each pulse created a microgravitational field that bent incoming energy weapons back toward their own source, completely disabled navigation systems across half-kilometer radius, and punched clean through the specific grade of shielding that Vorkai warships had considered entirely impenetrable for 200 years. In the first 4 minutes of contact, Drathvel lost 63 ships. 63. He had never in his entire career lost 63 ships in a full campaign. His total losses across 11 conquered worlds amounted to 11 vessels. He had considered those 11 an unfortunate but entirely acceptable cost of doing difficult work. 63 ships in 4 minutes. He pulled the fleet back immediately, reformed the formation, and ran a complete diagnostic. His systems confirmed what his eyes had already processed. The losses were real and permanent. The technology behind the mines was real and unprecedented. And his long-range scanners were now detecting something else, small, extremely fast human vessels that had been sitting completely invisible inside the deep gravitational shadow of the planet's large moon. They had used the chaos and confusion of the minefield detonation to launch quietly and scatter in all directions, each one firing short, precise targeted strikes at individual ships in his formation, before accelerating away faster than his targeting systems could reliably track. The human vessels were small. They were, by every objective measurement, fragile. They should not have been able to affect Vorkai warships in any meaningful way. But each one had been fitted with something that actively scattered Vorkai, shielding resonance frequencies, creating gaps that had never existed before. Every strike found one of those gaps. Every gap allowed real damage through. Drathvel watched his tactical display update in real time and felt something he had not allowed himself to feel since his very first campaign, 4 centuries earlier. Genuine uncertainty about the outcome in front of him. Back on Earth, Commander Voss was watching the exact same battle play out on a different screen. The operations room around him was absolutely silent. 40 officers stood around a central holographic display, watching hundreds of small moving points of light represent human pilots flying their fragile ships directly into the largest war fleet that humanity had ever seen. Some of those points of light had already gone still. People were dying out there in the dark, between the orbit of Saturn and the asteroid belt, and everyone in that room understood it with complete clarity. Voss had told them this would happen. He had warned every single volunteer. He had given everyone who asked an honest accounting of the numbers, the odds, and the expected losses. And he had given everyone present every opportunity, multiple times, to step back without shame. Not one person had stepped back. Lieutenant Holt stood beside him, her face pale but her expression absolutely steady. "Phase 2, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Voss watched the display for another few seconds, counted the lights that had gone still and would not move again. "Phase 2, he said. And somewhere in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, something humanity had been constructing in absolute secrecy for 11 straight years, powered on for the very first time. The Vorkai later called it the silence weapon in every official record that survived. They never found a more accurate name for it, because they never fully understood the physics behind what it actually was. Humanity called it Project Longbow. For 11 years, while the rest of the galaxy had been actively ignoring Earth, a team of 14,000 scientists, engineers, materials specialists, and military strategists had been working inside a hollowed-out asteroid, sitting 2.7 astronomical units from the Sun, well beyond Mars, buried in the rock and ice of the belt. The installation had no public presence anywhere, no funding trail that any outside intelligence service could follow, no official government acknowledgement on any record accessible to any foreign power. As far as the broader human public had been told, the asteroid was a long-term mining and geological research installation. What they had been building inside, it had no precedent in human history. From the moment Voss gave the activation order, it took 7 minutes for Project Longbow to reach full operational status. During those 7 minutes, the battle in the outer solar system continued without pause. More human pilots fell. More small ships stopped moving on the tactical display and stayed still. The Vorkai, beginning to recover from their initial shock, were doing exactly what they always did after a surprise. They were learning, adapting, recalculating, routing their formation around the remaining mine field, adjusting their shield systems to reduce the effectiveness of the human strike craft, pressing steadily forward with the patience of a civilization that had been doing exactly this for 400,000 years. Drathvel had now lost 112 ships, an absolutely unprecedented number in his personal history and in the recorded history of any Vorkai campaign. But he still commanded 2,888 fully operational warships. He could still read the mathematics of the situation clearly and calmly. Humanity was buying time, not winning a war. The gap was still enormous. The outcome was still, by any reasonable calculation, inevitable. He ordered his fleet into a three-pronged advance formation and pushed the entire force toward Earth at maximum sustainable speed. He never saw Longbow fire. Nobody ever saw Longbow fire. That was precisely the point. What Project Longbow generated, and what humanity had spent 11 years working out how to produce from principles that most galactic physicists had written off as theoretical impossibilities, was a field of directed quantum interference across a specifically defined volume of space. Not an explosion with a visible shockwave, not a beam of any kind, not a physical projectile, a field, silent, invisible, instantaneous across its entire effective range, and within that range, absolute. Inside the field, every quantum-level process that any Vorkai vessel depended on to function, power generation, gravitational drives, navigation, weapon systems, life support, internal communications, stopped. Not disrupted, not damaged in any conventional sense. Simply stopped. As if the foundational physical laws governing those specific processes, inside that specific volume of space, had been quietly and permanently switched off. 1,400 Vorkai ships crossed into the effective range of Project Longbow. Every single one of them went dark and silent within 3 seconds of each other. 1,400 ships. 1,400 complete crews. Every single being aboard them alive and unharmed, but without power of any kind, drifting in the dark, completely unable to call for help, move under their own power, respond to any threat, or do anything at all except wait in the silent dark and think about what had just happened. On Drathvel's bridge, every system died simultaneously. The lights went out completely. Every display went dark. The deep constant hum of the ship's drives, which had been present in the background of every waking moment of his career, stopped so suddenly and so completely that for a full second it seemed as though the universe itself had simply gone quiet. Then the emergency lighting came on, dim red, just enough to see by, and Drathvel stood alone in the center of his dead bridge and understood, for the first time in 4 centuries of unbroken conquest, that he had made a catastrophic and irreversible mistake. Kaelsorn's voice came through the dim red silence, careful and low. "Commander, what do we do?" Drathvel walked to the forward viewport, actual transparent material, a design element that had been kept in every Vorkai warship for exactly these kinds of complete system failures. and looked out at the space surrounding his vessel. Where there had been a fleet, there were now only drifting shapes, dark and still and absolutely silent. 1,400 warships going nowhere and doing nothing. And beyond them, in the far distance, the small blue planet that the entire galaxy had spent thousands of years choosing not to look at closely. He pressed his hand flat against the viewport glass. In 400 years, he had never stood inside a dead ship watching his fleet float like debris. He thought about the message Voss had sent before the engagement began. "We are not afraid. Come ahead. We will be ready." They had been ready. Everything his civilization knew about humanity, primitive, backward, barely worthy of any notation, certainly not worth any real concern, was wrong. All of it, every intelligence report, every threat assessment, every calm and confident vote in the halls of the Galactic Assembly. Wronged. He pressed his fist against the viewport. Not in anger. In something that felt, to a being who had not felt it in centuries, remarkably close to awe. It took 12 hours for humanity to establish direct communication with the disabled Vorkai fleet. Voss insisted on doing it himself and in person. His senior staff argued strongly against it. Too dangerous, they said. Even with 1,400 ships sitting dark and completely helpless, the remaining 1,400 vessels on the outer edge of the engagement zone were still fully powered, still fully armed, and still entirely capable of decisive action. If Drathvel gave the order to sacrifice his disabled ships and advance with the remaining force, humanity would still face an overwhelming military situation. Voss going out personally in a single small shuttle changed nothing about that risk and added a new one. Voss heard every argument. He thanked the people who made them. Then he went anyway. He took a single shuttle, completely unarmed and with no escort of any kind, and flew it slowly and deliberately into the debris field of drifting Vorkai ships. He broadcast on every frequency simultaneously. The message was as simple as he could make it. "I want to speak with your commander." Only that. Nothing more. There was a long silence, long enough that Lieutenant Holt, watching on the operations display from Lunar Station 7, reportedly stopped breathing for several seconds. Then a response came through. Not from the disabled ships. From the Vorkai command vessel sitting at the far edge of the field, fully powered and fully armed. "This is Supreme Commander Drathvel. You are either the bravest individual I have encountered in 4 centuries of active service, or the most completely foolish. I have not yet determined which assessment is more accurate." Voss allowed himself a brief, quiet smile that nobody on his end could see. "Come meet me in the middle," he said, "and find out." They met exactly halfway between the silent fleet and the blue light of Earth. 2 small shuttles drifting side by side in open space. No weapons visible. No security personnel on either side. Just 2 commanders, separated by millennia of evolutionary history and the wreckage of a battle that should not have been survivable, talking through a shared open communication link. Drathvel spoke first. "How long have you been preparing for this engagement?" "Longer than you have been watching us," Voss said. "We knew this day was coming eventually. Perhaps not from your people specifically, but we knew someone would come. Because that is the pattern out here, isn't it? You find the civilizations that are developing too quickly, and you remove them before they can become a real challenge. We understood that pattern long before today." Drathvel was quiet. "Yes," he said. "That is the pattern. Then you understand completely why we had absolutely no choice but to be ready." Another silence stretched between the 2 shuttles. Outside, the drifting shapes of 1,400 powerless warships floated past in the dark. "Your gravitational mind technology," Drathvel said. "Your quantum interference field. These are technologies that civilizations measured in millions of years of development have not successfully built. Explain to me how a species at your developmental stage produced them." Voss leaned forward in his seat. He thought carefully about how to answer that question honestly. He thought about 11 years of work inside cold, dark asteroid. About 14,000 people who had given everything they had to build something the rest of the galaxy believed was impossible. He thought about the pilots who had died in the outer solar system, buying 7 minutes of time for a weapon to power up. He thought about every person in that briefing room on Lunar Station 7 who had started working the moment the report arrived, fully believing they probably would not survive. "When you tell a species that they do not matter," Voss said quietly, "and that species decides to prove you wrong, you should take a step back and very carefully watch what happens next. Because that species will work harder than anything you have ever seen. They will be angrier, and more inventive, and more completely determined than any civilization that was simply handed power and never had to fight to keep it." He paused. "We have spent our entire existence proving people wrong. I would argue at this point that it is basically our primary defining characteristic as a species." Drathvel looked out at his disabled fleet for a long time. At 1,400 dark hulls that had been considered unstoppable 2 days ago. "You could have destroyed all of them," he said. "You had the capability. You chose not to use it. Tell me why." This was the question Voss had been waiting for since the moment the first alien signal had entered the solar system. "Because we are not what you came here believing we were," he said simply. "We do not want to erase anyone. We never did. We only ever wanted to be left alone long enough to become what we are supposed to become. But the galaxy needed to understand something real before that could happen." "Which is?" Voss turned and looked out through his viewport at Earth, the blue light of it filling the small cabin. The world that had survived ice ages and mass extinctions and plagues and wars and, in the last 72 hours, 3,000 alien warships. "That there is a cost," he said. "A real, permanent, unavoidable cost for anyone who decides that humanity is background noise. We are not a problem to be managed, or a threat to be neutralized before it develops. We are something this galaxy has genuinely never encountered before. And now you know it with complete certainty." Drathvel was silent for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the certainty that had defined it for 400 years. "Yes," he said quietly. "Now we know it." Drathvel returned to Voakai space with his surviving fleet and filed a report that shook his empire in ways that took decades to fully understand. He did not minimize a single thing that had happened. He did not adjust the numbers or wrap the failure in diplomatic language. He was a warrior of 4 centuries, and warriors told the truth about battles regardless of how much that truth cost them personally. He reported that 3,000 ships had engaged a civilization that every available intelligence assessment had classified as pre-significant. That the engagement had resulted in the permanent loss of 541 vessels and their complete crews. That 1,400 additional vessels had been rendered non-operational by a technology for which Voakai science had no framework, no name, and no known countermeasure. That the mission had been abandoned. That the target world remained completely undamaged. Earth, completely undamaged. Not one crater, not one burned city, not one human settlement touched by a single Voakai weapon. The Galactic Assembly met in emergency session 48 hours after Drathvel's report reached the member civilizations. The session lasted 9 full days. Humanity was not represented. Voss was not invited. In the formal language of the Assembly, humans were still technically a non-member civilization, still officially classified as a developing species, not yet ready for full galactic participation. The rules had not changed, but the room had changed entirely. Because every single civilization sitting in that chamber had spent the previous 48 hours doing the same thing. Going back through their files, rereading every intelligence report, every survey, every observational study that had ever been compiled on humanity, running their own independent analyses, asking the same question in every language spoken in that hall. How did we miss this? The answer was always the same, in every language, from every analyst. They had not missed it. The information had always been present. The rate of human technological development, extraordinary for a species of their age. The biological anomalies, a pain tolerance that bordered on something that other species would classify as simply irrational. A capacity for sleep deprivation that outlasted most known alien biology by significant margins. An immune system that learned from each threat it survived and rewrote itself accordingly. A brain architecture that processed emotion and logic not as separate, competing systems, but as a single unified force that produced, specifically under conditions of extreme pressure, a quality of creative problem-solving that no other known species in the database could match at comparable technological levels. All of it had been in the data for centuries. They had looked at the data, and then they had decided it did not matter enough to look at carefully. Back on Earth, life continued in ways that looked, from the outside, surprisingly ordinary. There were celebrations in every major city on the planet. People gathered in squares and on rooftops and on the edges of cliffs and beaches and looked up at the same sky that had, for 72 hours, held something vast and dark and specifically intended to end everything they had ever known. They looked up at that sky, and then the sky was clear again, and the world kept turning the same as it always had. Voss was sitting alone in his office on Lunar Station 7 for the first time in 4 days. He had not slept properly. He had not eaten enough. He was running on the same fuel that had kept him functioning since the moment the first report landed on his desk, a specific combination of purpose, pressure, and the particular brand of stubborn refusal to stop that humans had been mistaking for simple courage since the beginning of recorded history. He was reading a new message. It had arrived through official secured channels, authenticated by 3 separate galactic communication protocols. It originated from the office of the Galactic Assembly Secretariat. It was an application form. Formal language, careful wording, the kind of multilateral diplomatic phrasing that took entire committees years of negotiation to agree on. But underneath all the careful, measured words, the meaning was perfectly clear. Humanity was being invited to take a seat at the table. Not as a conquered world being managed by its conquerors. Not as a protected species being watched over by civilizations that had decided to be generous. Not as background noise that had gotten loud enough to be annoying. As a full member. As an equal. Voss read the message twice. He set it down on his desk. He picked it up and read it again. He thought about every human being who had ever been told they were not enough for the room they were trying to enter. He thought about every civilization across history that had been dismissed or overlooked or deliberately kept small, not because they lacked the capability to be more, but simply because the people with the power to decide had looked at them briefly and concluded, without looking carefully, that they did not matter. He thought about what humanity was going to do with a seat at that table. He allowed himself, for the first time since the report had arrived, a real and unguarded smile. Then he picked up his pen and started filling out the form. Now here is the part that stays with you long after the story ends. Drathvel, after returning to his empire, spent the remaining years of his command doing something that no senior Vorkai officer had ever done in the recorded history of the empire. He argued against the policy of preemptive elimination. He stood in halls full of powerful beings who did not want to hear what he was saying, and he said it anyway, repeatedly, for years, that the strongest civilizations the galaxy had ever produced were not necessarily the ones that had never been seriously challenged. They were the ones that had been challenged the most, and had chosen, every single time, not to break. He never returned to Earth. He never spoke directly to Voss again. But according to records that survived the following century, Drathvel kept a single image on his desk from the day of the battle until the last day of his life. It was a photograph of Earth from space. Blue, small, impossibly calm from that distance, completely unaware of how closely it had approached being erased. He had no official caption written on it, no documentation, no formal notation in any record. Just one word, handwritten in his own script, which translates into English roughly as, "Be careful." The galaxy had spent thousands of years choosing to look away from humanity. Now it looked, very carefully, all the time. And in the quiet of deep space, in the private communications of the most powerful empires in the known universe, a new understanding had settled into place permanently. Some species, when you decide they have grown too capable, you stop before they can become a real problem. And some species, the ones that have been forged by loss and refusal and the specific, unreasonable determination to survive everything the universe throws at them. Some species you simply do not touch. What you just experienced was not simply a story about a battle between species. It was a story about what happens when the most overlooked, most underestimated species in the entire galaxy finally decides that it has been overlooked for long enough. Humanity did not win because of luck or because the numbers accidentally fell their way. They won because of something that the galaxy, for all its ancient power and accumulated knowledge, had never properly accounted for, the specific and completely unstoppable force of a civilization that had been told, again and again, that it did not matter, and had spent every generation since channeling that into something extraordinary. 3 things to carry with you from this story. First, being underestimated is not a weakness. It is the most dangerous advantage in existence, if you use the time it gives you wisely and quietly. Second, the most powerful force in the known universe is not a fleet of warships or a technology that can silence 3,000 ships in 3 seconds. It is a species that keeps working, keeps building, keeps moving forward even when every number in front of it says to stop. And third, the galaxy learned something that day that it had somehow missed across thousands of years of observation. Background noise, given enough time and enough reason, has a way of becoming the loudest thing in the room. Here is the question I want you to think about and answer in the comments below. If you were Voss, sitting in that briefing room with 72 hours and an entire planet depending on what you did next, what single human quality would you bet everything on to get through it? Drop your answer below. Every single comment gets read. If this story connected with you in any real way, if it left you feeling something, please take 2 seconds to hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Every person who subscribes makes this community a little bigger and a little stronger, and it means more stories like this one can keep coming. And if you want to keep going right now, there is another story already waiting on this channel. A lone human soldier, stranded deep behind enemy lines in a war that humanity was never supposed to survive. With no backup, no weapons, and one single impossible choice in front of him. If this story opened your eyes, that one will change how you see everything. See you there.